So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I think we'll get started. My name is David Lesher. I'm the Government Affairs Director at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California. And I'm sure most of you are aware of PPIC. We are a nonpartisan, independent think tank. We do research on most of the topics that cross the plate here in Sacramento, including, and as well, a statewide survey that comes out almost every month. And so today we're going to talk about realignment, incarceration, and crime trends. I'll get to the introduction in a moment, but just a couple quick announcements first. First, a thank you to the James Irvine Foundation. This event is part of a briefing series that the Irvine Foundation funds so that we can hold public events and give free lunches to talk about some of the research work that we do. So thank you, the Irvine Foundation. Also, the slides that you'll see, as well as the report and other material, is on our website at ppic.org. And also, on your chair, you should have found a copy of the report plus like a salmon-colored sheet that's an evaluation. And if you wanted to fill that out at the end and drop it off on the table on your way out and tell us how you think we did and what you learned and other things and what a great moderator there was here, it would be much appreciated. And then also, this is being taped for broadcast, so if you want to silence your cell phones, you might avoid calling attention to yourself unless that's what you're looking for. And then one other thing, on our next event is June 11th, and that will be in this same room, and it will be PPIC's Senior Research Fellow Hans Johnson will be talking about online learning at California community colleges. So that's not yet posted on our website, so you can't sign up for it, but it will be soon. It's June 11th. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker today, and then after he's done with the presentation, I'll come back up and moderate Q&A with our speaker and his co-author. So let me introduce Magnus Lofstrom. He is a senior research fellow at PPIC and has been with PPIC for several years. He got his PhD from UC San Diego in economics, and recently, for the last several years, he's done a lot of work on realignment and crime trends and jail populations and other related things. So please welcome Magnus Lofstrom.
Great. Thanks, Dave, and thank you all for coming here today and giving us this opportunity to share with you our most recent research on realignment. Before we get started, I want to point out this is joint work with my good friend and professor at UC Berkeley in the Goldman School of Public Policy, Steve Raphael. He's going to join us here shortly. He's doing an interview with KPBS down in San Diego right now, but he's going to be here for the Q&A. So we'll get a chance to meet him, and he gets a chance to answer some of your questions. Importantly as well, this research was done with the extremely able help of Brandon Martin, which is usually the case. So we really appreciate that. Okay, so let me start off by kind of giving you an overview of what I'll be doing here for the next 25 minutes or so before we start our Q&A session. I'm going to start off by giving you a brief kind of background to realignment, very, very brief background to realignment, and then giving you also a brief overview of our research that has been focusing on the first year of realignment. Okay, so what do we find there in terms of those early impacts? And then we're going to move on to taking a look at that kind of situation, and particularly incarceration trends and crime trends, in the subsequent years after that first year, to have a better sense of where things are going as part of a very important effort, I think, which is to monitor how this substantial reform is playing out. So we're going to be looking at that. When we look at the crime trends, one of the key questions that we're going to be trying to answer there is, what is realignment's role in the state's crime trends? And then we're going to end up with conclusions and some recommendations as well. Okay, so as many of you are aware of and familiar with, realignment is truly a major public safety reform. I think it is fair to say that it is one of the most significant changes to our correction system in decades. So what is realignment? So the first thing is, let's talk very briefly about how it came about. So it really was prompted by the federal court order to reduce overcrowding in our prison system. So a 3-judge panel had determined in 2009 and ordered the state to reduce overcrowding down to 137.5% of its design capacity. And overcrowding was determined to be the underlying factor that prevented the state from providing adequate health and mental health to our prison population. The state appealed this, but the Supreme Court in May 2011 upheld it. So we're now at a point then where the state's got to figure out what to do. At that point in time, it had to reduce the prison population by about 35,000. It could resort to, theoretically, to a release of prison inmates, 35,000. There was no appetite for that, understanding full well what those public safety consequences could be. So a proposal was built, and it came from the governor's office, that shifted the responsibilities as well as funding from the state to the counties in a number of important ways regarding corrections. First, and one of the most important part, was that we can't send parole violators back to state prison anymore. So if someone is a released offender, a released felon who is picked up on a parole violation, will have to be locally sanctioned now. In the past, there was a common feature and common trait of our prison system was the parole violators would go back to the prison and serve some time there. And it was one of the key contributors to overcrowding in the state prison system. So no longer we can do that. Lower level felons now also go to county jail. So the lower level felons are these triple nons, the non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual offenders who have no record of one of those crimes, so no record of a sexual, violent, or serious offenses. In the past, of course, they were felons. They would go to state prison. Now they're going to county jail. So these are two of the key components that were intended to reduce our state prison system. There was also an overall aim to reduce reliance on incarceration as well, and these two features, as well as a few others, helped out with that. Another important part of realignment was that we shifted the supervision of released lower-level felons from our state prison system from state parole to county probation. And the hope here was that counties would look for evidence-based practices in order to reduce reoffending among these released offenders to a greater extent than maybe the state had done. So what do we see in that first year? Well, we see some substantial impacts. First, if we take a look at the prison population, we see that in just that first year alone, it dropped by about 27,000. So that's about a 17% drop in the prison population. So that's a substantial drop. There was, as I said, a shift in responsibilities from the state to the counties. And so not surprisingly, we saw that the county jail population went up. But it only went up a fraction of that drop, 27,000 drop. Roughly for every 3 fewer felons who go into state prison, we see that the county population, the county jail population goes up by 1. So what this means is that the county jail population increased by about 9,000 inmates in that first year alone. So what does this mean then in terms of offenders on the street? Well, we put this together, and the estimate is then that there's about 18,000 additional offenders who are on the street who prior to realignment would have been incarcerated in the state prison or county jail, but because of the reform are not. That, of course, raised some concerns about public safety. With that many offenders on the street, there were some serious concerns about that was going to lead to a very noticeable uptick in crime. We came out with a report in December of 2013, again, focusing on that first year of realignment, and we found that, well, the effect was really a very limited and modest impact on crime. There was no convincing evidence that violent crime went up as a result of realignment, but we did see an increase in property crime, specifically auto thefts, that we tied to realignment. Okay? So all that is based on the first year of realignment. And remember that realignment was implemented as of October 1st of 2011. We're now in the 4th year. But in many ways, we can't really get data that will carry us up to very recent times. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to look at what happened in subsequent years. We're going to look at what happens to incarceration, as I mentioned, in our jails and prison population, but also crime. But I think it's important that I point out right here and now that the crime data only takes us through 2013. So that only takes us into the second year. And the reason I'm making a point of this is that it's important for you to keep in mind that what we see here really has nothing to do with Prop 47. Okay? So we have really only data for the first 27 months of realignment when it comes to crime. But we can take a look at what's happening in our prison system, prison population, specifically in our county jail populations, a little bit further along. So for the jails, we can actually track them till June of 2014, which is still pre-Prop 47. Our prison population, when we wrote this report, we could track that till February of 2015, which means that we could look at the first 4 months of realignment. So let's take a look then at what we see in terms of incarceration trends, and specifically let's take a look at the prison population. And so here's a figure that shows you what the total prison population was starting January 2010, taking us through February of 2015. And you see that very noticeable drop in the prison population that I mentioned, the 27,000 in that first year in this graph here. But if we now follow up, what we see is that the prison population did not decrease any further beyond that first year. So the entire drop in the prison population that stems from realignment was concentrated on that first year. In fact, we see a little bit of an increase in the prison population in the second and the third year. And it's not until Prop 47 was passed in November of last year that we see start to see a decrease in the prison population. And it's a noticeable decrease. Just in those first 4 months, it dropped by about 5,000 inmates. And this is good news when we are thinking about the mandated target that the state needed to bring down its prison population to below 137.5% of design capacity, because we're finally down below that now. In February of this year, we were below that by about 1,200, and now it's below that target by over 2,000 inmates. So it looks quite good for the 2016 deadline. Moving on, taking a look at our jail population. So what do we see here? Again, if we have two lines here, the top line, the orange line, shows you the average daily jail population, the monthly average daily jail population, starting in September 2010 and takes us through June of 2014. And the blue line below are what I call capacity-constrained releases. So counties that are particularly under a court-ordered jail population caps will have to resort to capacity-constrained releases, something that we call sometimes early releases, when they reach a certain number of inmates in their facilities. Okay? And so we're going to take a look at that and see what would happen there. If we start with the top line, the average daily jail population, again, we see that noticeable increase in the first year. So that's the 9,000 that I mentioned just a minute ago. If we look at that second year, you see a slight continued increase in the jail population. In the second year, it went up by about 1,800. And then in the first 9 months of the third year of realignment, it went up by a further few hundred. But the increase in the jail population that we saw over the period from realignment was implemented to June 2014. 80% of that increase took place in that first year. So again, we're talking first year in terms of the biggest impact on our jails and the county population. The capacity-constrained releases, also we see an increase in those. So if we look at before realignment, on an average month, statewide and system-wide, there were about 10,700 capacity-constrained releases per month. After realignment, that went up. In that first year, the average was about 12,300. It's gone up a little bit further in the second year, and then kind of, on an average at least, leveled off in the third year. So there are some increases in the second and the third year, but they are far less than what we saw in that first year. So, so what does this tell us about California's reliance on incarceration? So putting these two graphs and these two kind of data sources together to get a sense of where we have gone in terms of our reliance on incarceration, and also ultimately maybe with an eye towards the impact on crime. Are we seeing more or less offenders on the street as a result of this particular reform? If we start by looking at the prison incarceration rate, so this is measured by the number of inmates in our state prison system per 100,000 residents. It's a measure that then adjusts for overall population growth. What we see that after that first year, very noticeable drop from 431 inmates per 100,000 residents to 355. In those subsequent years, in the second and the third year, there wasn't really much of a change there. So that stayed constant until Prop 47 passed in November of last year. And now we see that it's dropped from 355 to around 341. So more recent data shows that that's coming down. So there's further decreased reliance on incarceration in a prison population, at least coming from Prop 47. Jail incarceration, it's a very similar story. It really didn't rise much after it went from 191 per 100,000 residents to 214 a year into a realignment. So we see in that subsequent year, you saw a little bit of an increase in the jail population, and it brought the jail incarceration rate to about 216, but broadly pretty flat. And the increase in the early releases that we saw in the first year, it kind of leveled off, and we didn't see much of an increase in the second year or third year, but we have seen some of it. So, putting all this together and then looking at, all right, what does it tell us of additional offenders on the street? Well, it really shows quite clearly that realignment certainly didn't put any additional offenders on the street beyond what it did in the first year. And that number that we estimated and presented earlier of 18,000 is still the number that we're at. So let's move on then and take a look at what happened to crime and our crime rate trends here in California. Good news in 2013. Okay, so this is, again, let me point out, this is the most recent crime data that are available here for California or other states for that matter. It only takes us through 2013. But there was good news. After we saw an increase in violent crime in 2012, we see a drop in 2013. The violent crime rate, in fact, dropped by 6.4%. So that's actually a bigger drop than the increase that we saw the previous year. And that means that we're actually, in 2013, we were at a 46-year low in terms of our violent crime rate. So good news there. And it varies. It dropped from 5.3% in terms of rapes to 8% in murder. So very good news indeed there. If we shift our focus to property crime, we see that, well, that came down as well, but less than it did for violent crime. We saw an increase in property crime in 2012 that was quite noticeable. It was about 7.8%. But again, good news here in 2013, like I said, it dropped. It dropped by 3.8%. It varies. The burglary rate dropped by 6.4%. Larceny theft rate dropped by 3%. And motor vehicle theft rate dropped by 2.8%. So overall, this is all good news. And to some extent, what it might indicate then is that, well, maybe what we saw in 2012 was an anomaly. Okay, that was just a blip on a crime trend, and maybe then it had nothing to do with realignment. So, and that's indeed what we want to take a look at here. So in order to do that, it makes sense to compare California to other states to get a sense of whether our changes in the crime rates in these last few years stands out when we compare it to those other states. So let's start off by see how our drop in our violent and property crime stacks up compared to the rest of the country and some specific states as well. Again, our violent crime rate dropped by 6.4%. That's actually better than the drop nationwide of 5.1%. Okay, so that's good. But we don't necessarily stand out in terms of that drop. There were 18 other states that actually saw even bigger decreases than California. And you see a few examples here. So Montana, for example, saw a substantial drop in violent crime in 2013 of 13.7%. So if we shift and take a look at our property crime rate decline, we see that it actually didn't go down as much as it did in other states. So if we compare it to nationwide decline, our 3.8% drop is less than the 4.8% nationwide. And in fact, there were 33 other states that saw a bigger drop in the property crime rate than California. So if we just look at that, a quick comparison of California's changes in 2013 to the nation and other states, it suggests that, yes, it is good news, but we don't stand out, that it wasn't necessarily a whole lot better than other states. Violent crime, it was better than nationwide. Property crime, not so much. But what we would like to do then is we really want to measure the effect of realignment on our crime trends. So how can we go about doing that? What we're doing here is recognizing that what we need to do is estimate what the crime trends would have been if realignment had not been implemented. That is the so-called counterfactual that we're looking for here, is what would they look like? What would happen to property crime if we didn't implement realignment? And the question then is, well, how do you actually answer that question? How do you actually estimate what our crime rate trends would have been if we didn't implement this very big and important reform? So we're going to go back to the same method that we used in our earlier report, which is called a synthetic control approach. It's a data-driven technique to identify states with pre-realignment crime trends that are very similar to California's. And once we've established then that we can identify states that had really the same kind of crime trends as California did prior to realignment, they then represent what the crime trends would have been in California if we had not passed this reform. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Violent crime, here's what we see. Our method here is quite successful at identifying a set of comparison states that prior to realignment had really similar crime trends. And when we look post-realignment, we don't see any evidence that there is any deviation from that. We continue to track what happens in those comparison states. Okay? So that shows us that there's no evidence then that our violent crime rate trend has been affected by realignment. We can break down these trends by the offense categories that are part of the violent crimes. So again, rape, murder, aggravated assault, and robbery, and do the analysis separately for each of those. And we find the same results. There is no evidence of any deviation from the comparison states post-realignment. What about property crime rate? Again, the first part here, for this to be really a meaningful approach to answer this question, is to make sure that we can find states that match up with California in terms of pre-realignment crime rate trends. And I think it's fair to say that this method does a pretty good job at that. California's crime rate trend is really overlapping with the comparison states there. So what we then observe is that in 2011, so that is the first year of realignment, we only had 3 months of realignment in 2011, we start to see that it deviates a little bit. So we see a little bit of uptick in 2011, and then we see a noticeable uptick that is statistically significant in 2012. And that's exactly what we reported in that previous report. Now, we do know that property crime dropped in California in 2013. What we see here when we compare California to those comparison states is that, well, they had pretty much the exact same kind of drop. So the gap that emerged in 2012 remains the same. Okay? So there are no changes there. It still suggests that that gap that emerged then in 2012 remains the same. Okay, so let's wrap this up. So what are our conclusions and some recommendations here? Realignment certainly decreased California's reliance on incarceration. We saw a very noticeable drop in the prison population. We did see an increase in the jail population, but it certainly didn't correspond to the decline in the prison population. If we take a look at our overall incarceration rate, that is when we combine both the prison and the jail population, it dropped in these first couple of years by about 8%. And we see that we did this without any impact on violent crime. We really don't find any evidence that violent crime increased as a result of this move towards decrease our reliance on incarceration. We did find evidence, however, that there was a modest increase in property crime that was really driven by an increase in motor vehicle thefts. So to put a number on that, the increased auto theft rate that we estimate is that it went up by about 70 per 100,000 residents. That's about a 17% drop. So if we put these things together then, what does our data tell us? Well, in our analysis, it tells us that incarceration, well, it does prevent some crime. Okay? The data shows that, our analysis shows that, but it also shows that at current incarceration rates, or the levels we were at around the realignment and where we're at now, it has a very limited crime preventive effect. Okay? We don't really prevent that many crimes. We do prevent some. Most specifically, the crimes that we do prevent are property crime. We estimated in the earlier report, and since the results hold the same, that for that additional offender that we lock up in our state prison system, it prevents about 1.2 property crimes per year. Okay? Put differently, it's 1.2 auto thefts per year for that additional offenders that we lock up. If we put this in a cost-benefit perspective, we compare that, we look at that, all right, well, it does prevent. When we do make that marginal change and we lock up an additional offender, it does have a benefit. It prevents 1.2 auto thefts. That's a benefit. It comes with a cost as well. Now, our prison system isn't cheap. If we simply just look at that dollar cost, what it tells us is that an additional dollar spent on incarceration, it only yields 23 cents in terms of crime prevention or crime benefits. Okay? So that's not a very good return on our investment there. So instead, what we need to do is look for alternative strategies, alternative crime preventive strategies. We've highlighted a few in our previous work, and we also mentioned them in this shorter report as well. And that includes increased policing, okay? Increased number of police. We only have data when it comes to the number of police officers in California up to 2013. If we look at the period between 2008 and 2013, that dropped by over 3,000 officers, so that's 8%. Most importantly, though, is that research shows that that's a way to actually prevent crime, and it's much more cost-effective than relying on incarceration. It'd be a mistake to just pursue a particular strategy. Instead, I think what we need to do is focus on identifying kind of the right mix of crime preventive strategies. That could also include that we look at early childhood programs. It could look at targeted intervention at-risk youth. It could look at things like cognitive behavioral therapy. Those are some of the things. How we handle the probationers following the lead of Hawaii with their HOPE program that is very promising are some of the other strategies. But there's also, in this context of realignment, there's also another thing that we need to keep in mind. We shifted the responsibility in how we deal with released offenders from the state to the counties and the county probation systems. So counties can now determine what they think works best, and there are a number of experiments that are taking place in California at this time. The key thing is to identify really what works. Build on the experiences of the counties to identify what it works, and then see where that can be replicated and to what extent that can be replicated. That will give us an opportunity to reduce reoffending amongst our released offender population. And that's it. So, Steve, you want to come up here, and we're going to take some questions then.
So thank you very much, Magnus. Steve Raphael is joining our panel here, so I will moderate and take questions from the audience. But we have a microphone that's going around because this is being taped for broadcast, like I said. So before you ask a question, please wait for the microphone. So any questions? Yes.
So I know this work is based on state-level data, but it's, of course, derived from local reports. To what extent do you have a sense of heterogeneity within California and these effects? Namely, is Los Angeles different from the rest of the state, and are there any relevant policy implications you'd like to talk about there?
Yeah. We actually, in the first report, we did look at local variation, and so you can basically see the same patterns in cross-county sort of comparisons of changes in crime and changes in the number of the county's residents in their state prison system, as you do when you compare California to other states. And we tried also, because counties vary a lot in their base incarceration rates, with some in the Central Valley having very high and some having very low. So we made some effort to see whether or not there's evidence of what you might think of as diminishing returns, that the counties with very high incarceration rates were buying very little crime decline, and the counties with the low were buying, perhaps having more of an increase as a result of realignment. Those results were very tentative. We found maybe a little of evidence suggesting that if there was a per, sort of realigned inmate effect and heterogeneity across counties, that it would, if anything, probably be larger in the counties that have low incarceration rates. That's about as much as I think we can say responsibly.
When you spoke about drop in crime, me being involved with city council, are you saying that drop in crime due to increased policing? And then the second one, it says the key thing, identify what works, and what we're dealing with, what works in various communities in different cities. And back to the increased policing, we did find stats that when the police was increased in certain areas, the crimes did drop.
Yeah. There's actually a robust and fairly large research literature that simply shows a pretty strong relationship between police staffing levels and crime rates. And relative to the rest of the country, the West tends to have a different policing model where it's more patrolling by car, smaller police forces. And so one of the things that we have suggested in particular is that if we were thinking in terms of almost a justice reinvestment initiative sort of framework, that having more money in policing at the front end would likely sort of address whatever residual effects there are of realignment. Maybe do you want to add this regarding staffing levels, Magnus?
Well, as I mentioned during the talk, we have seen a decrease in the number of police officers. There's a decrease in the sheriff's officer as well, but in 2013 that went up a little bit. Partly, I'm suspecting that's due to realignment funding as well. I think it's worthwhile also to point out that when we're thinking about the impact of increased policing on crime, a big part of that is the deterrent effect, that it deters crime. So it puts an upward pressure to some extent on incarceration, but it's countered by the deterrent effect that we see less crime as well, and then there's less to arrest and less people to lock up as well.
Did you consider alternative explanations for the rise in auto thefts?
Well, I guess what we have done is we've tried to, in the language of research, create sort of counterfactual paths that we would have seen in the absence of realignment. So, for example, you can compare the county that had a large increase in their, population as a result of realignment to the county that had less, and then adjust for things about the county and time trends and things like that. Or in the cross-state analysis that was presented today, we compare California to other states that match California in the pre-realignment period, and the only thing that differs between them, or presumably by assumption, I guess, is that we instituted realignment and they didn't. And so it's, in essence, what we're kind of assuming when we do the state-level analysis is that the trends for the other states is reflecting all the other factors that are not realignment related.
And I think it's to us it's very comforting in when it comes to the conclusions interpretation is that when we do the analysis focusing on the counties, we're focusing in specifically on something that was driven by realignment. That was really, the additional offenders on the street on the county level, how it changes over time. We derive estimates on that, and it gives us the exact same picture that we derive from the state level analysis as well. And in terms of the magnitudes as well are in the ballpark. So that's rather convincing to us.
I don't think this is the same question, but I'm going to ask it in a different way. On the auto theft stat, is this a blanket increase across California, or were there counties that were driving this increase that might indicate other local factors at work, presence of chop shops or auto theft rings?
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that specifically, if there are certain counties that are driving that. So couldn't tell you if that's the case.
But it does appear to be the case that the counties that, you know, in a cross-county analysis, you see the counties that had the largest reduction in the size of their residents that were in the state prison population, they experienced the bigger increases in auto theft as a result, right? So we do know that. But in terms of heterogeneity and that effect, that's a little bit harder to pin down simply because everybody's kind of in the same range.
Did you have the opportunity to look at effect of technology and the proactive use of technology in fighting crime?
So like cameras and, well, not in this study, we didn't. So perhaps that might be impacting crime trends. In fact, we were both just kind of thinking about the underlying trends that we're seeing across states in this sort of secular trend towards lower crime and wondering, you know, how much of this could be that everybody's on video camera now, and perhaps that's what we're seeing. So we don't do that in this study, but that's clearly a very important issue and should be studied by someone.
Hi, I was wondering if there was a commonly accepted explanation now for the drop in violent crime that we are seeing across the country. I've heard numerous theories, but...
Yeah, there are a number. Part of it is, you know, we had such a huge increase in our prison population. That probably explains some of it, although many who study crime in prison argue and believe that the effect is diminishing on the margin. So somewhere around the 1990s, further increases in prison became much less effective. But aside from that, there are a lot of other things that have happened in the country that have lowered crime. So we've become somewhat older, we've become more educated, we have more immigrants. Immigrants tend to offend at a lower rate, contrary to perhaps what many might believe. And there's also the speculation out there that the introduction or the removal of lead from paint and from gasoline may have had a long-term effect on violence via the cognitive abilities of people as they grow up that would be lagged. So I am, you know, just sort of discreetly dumber than people younger than me because I grew up when there was lead paint in the soil. So you know, these are issues that are kind of debated at a national level, and the jury is out on most of these explanations.
First of all, thank you very much for the very useful and interesting report. My question is about the marginal rate of return on incarceration. So you estimate that we're currently getting about 23 cents per dollar back that we spend on incarceration. I'm wondering if you tried to look at what point that flips and we start getting more return on our dollar. So obviously we're incarcerating a little over 200,000 people right now if you consider jail and prison together in California. Have you attempted to kind of pinpoint at what point, you know, is it when we get down to 150 or 160? Like when would it become more, when would it become fiscally prudent to incarcerate, you know, more people?
Well, we haven't looked at that specifically. I think it's part of it is that the data that we have suggests that pattern that there is a decrease, there's a diminishing marginal return to incarceration. So I think it would be a little bit too optimistic to take that next step and say that, oh, once we hit this particular level, now it's something that is cost effective. But I think it raises an important point here. We are decreasing our reliance on incarceration. We did it through realignment. We're doing it through Prop 47 as well in a meaningful way. And it means that it's, you know, in these times is really the time when we need to think very seriously about what are the best alternative crime preventive strategies. Incarceration is not a particularly good way of preventing crime, but it is an important time for us to identify and not just sit back and say we're going to draw down the prison and the jail population and just, you know, cross our fingers and hope that the crime is not going to go up again. We need to come up with the alternative solutions as well to make sure that doesn't happen.
There's a big difference between the cost of violent crime and property crime too, so it's hard to estimate that cost of violent crime.
In your recommendations for increasing policing as part of one of the strategies, do you also have recommendations for types of strategies for police to apply, especially in today's climate? I mean, if just adding police officers is a deterrent, don't they also need to apply some community strategies that engage the community in their activities?
You want to take that one?
No,
Okay.
you're there. You look closer at that.
Well, you know, we haven't analyzed the effects of alternative policing strategies, so we didn't want to make any specific recommendation based on our analysis here. However, we do know that police staffing levels are robustly related to crime rates. In my mind, I like to separate the issues of staffing levels from police modes. And you know, they're clearly related on some level, and one might even think that a really small, overtaxed police force might end up policing in manners that perhaps are not conducive to good community relations simply as a result of being understaffed. But nonetheless, you know, we believe, you know, clearly there are issues in policing that that need to be worked on, and you know, relations with communities, with minority communities, policing violence are, you know, clearly very, very important, and it has to be done in a smart way that is inclusive and respectful of the citizens.
Did you notice any significant trends between women prisoners and men prisoners? Were there any significant differences?
We haven't looked at that issue yet. I think it is an important issue, the gender issue. It is a mostly overlooked issue, and that deserves more attention, but we have not looked at it yet.
Although 90% of the inmates, I think, are male in
Yeah,
California.
close to.
It seems like one of the big benefits of realignment could be better access to quality substance abuse and mental health treatment in the community. The other states that you compared in the analysis, did you happen to know how much they invest in treatment?
No, we don't. We don't know how much they invest in treatment relative to California. But I agree with you that, you know, I'm sure there are people from probation departments in the room, but treatment in probation is going to be a lot different than treatment in parole, and there is an opportunity here to bring more perhaps rehabilitative resources to bear for people that are reentering, and that I believe is a plus of realignment. Although again, I think to echo one of Magnus's closing remarks, this is a time where, you know, probation departments and counties can really learn from one another as everybody's dealing differently and trying different things, and all this experimentation hopefully will result in, you know, best practices emerging and kind of a common core of knowledge that everyone can draw upon.
Do you know if the increase in crime in 2012 or in the first year, do you know which population might have affected that? Like if the realigned population were the offenders contributing to that increase?
So, yeah,
go ahead.
Well, I mean, the only crime that we're attributing to realignment at all is motor vehicle theft. And the timing is such that it suggests that the spike that we're seeing is attributable either to the PRCS population that's not sitting in county jail, or people who are displaced from county jail as a result of PRCS folks doing parole violations in county jail. So yes, we would argue that small increase that we see was a result that it had to be related to the offenders that were realigned as a result of the reform.
Right. When we talk about a spike in motor vehicle theft, it appears that there's actually a 2.8% decrease, but if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that this is less of a decrease than we would have expected absent realignment? Is that what you mean by a spike?
Or so a gap opened up in 2012, right? So from 11 to 12, property or motor vehicle theft rose. 2012, 2013, it dropped a little bit. But when you look at our synthetic California, our other universe California, right, which are these states that we're using as a comparison group, it also dropped there. So the exercise is, we used a computer algorithm to find a combination of states that looks like California before 2010, and then we say anything that happens in states is what would have happened in the absence of realignment. And between 12 and 13, their auto theft rates dropped too. So essentially, we're still charting them, but we used to chart them right on top of their line, and now we're charting them with a little difference between ours and theirs, and that's the yeah.
But I guess that overall there was still a 2.8% drop
from 2012 2013.
That's right. 2013. Okay,
yeah.
Did your study look at all at probation and parole violations after realignment, and also look at recidivism rates?
We haven't done that, and this study focuses specifically on the crime rate trends. We have produced 2 reports at PPIC before where we look at the recidivism rates in that first year of realignment. It actually takes us a little bit further than the first year. One of them that Steve and I co-authored together with colleague Raikin Grete, I think we can summarize it as recidivism rates are roughly in line with what we saw prior to realignment. There is a slight decrease in the rearrest rate. The most noticeable thing that happened post-realignment in terms of one measure of recidivism rate, and that's the return to state custody, is that it dropped significantly. Went down to single digit, but that's exactly what realignment set out to do. You can't send back parole violators to state prison anymore.
Hello. I appreciate the recommendation for investment. I don't think it would have an immediate drop in numbers, but I believe that incarcerated individuals have a high number of mental illness or neurological disorders. So I've thought about this because unfortunately I've had much research done for my son, ADHD type 3. So I think if we invest in our children, identifying those behavior issues, treating them, providing behavioral management, that would be a great investment long term. When they're a child, it seems easier to get them on that program rather than a grown adult and reacting to the data versus investing and being proactive. So I'd love to see more of that.
Okay. No, we agree, and I think it's also part of this, as I'm saying, is when we're thinking about managing public safety is to think broadly about it and definitely think about early interventions that not just when it comes to crime prevention, but for so many other issues as well is very beneficial, and it tends to be a very cost-effective way of dealing with issues, social issues.
So you do note a slow increase in jail populations. It's kind of a twofold question. One is in thinking about the fiscal incentives under realignment for incarceration strategies and whether California has more or less got it right in terms of not over-incentivizing sending for local authorities to incarcerate locally for fiscal reasons, because I know some other states have struggled with that question. And then second, how much of the slow increase is driven by jail capacity? Because I know we have real constraints with county jails as well as the state prisons.
Well, I think if we take the second question there, counties are struggling. There are seriously capacity challenged. We are operating statewide, system-wide at about 104%. At least this is June of 2014 of design capacity. But that's just looking at the number of beds. I think that's going to come down with Prop 47. But I think when we think about capacity and resources and county jails now, it's very important that we think about the types of facilities that counties have. Are they in a position to provide the services and treatments and the programming that are needed? Health services, mental health services, substance abuse services. You have an offender population that's going to be spending a much longer time than the population that you served prior to realignment. So I think that's the big issue. Brandon and I wrote a report that came out, I think it was last year, that we looked at our investment in jails and also noticed that a good number of our jail facilities are very old. If they're built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they're really not set out to handle the kind of responsibilities that the counties are dealing with today. And so we need to look at that. The state, having said all that, the state has provided money for counties to address some of these issues. And so far, we're looking at about $2.2 billion that have been set aside for county jail investments.
I can say something to the first question. That's an interesting question. That, I think, with the exception of 4 states, that have a unified prison jail system, every state struggles with the incentives that counties face versus the state. And, oftentimes I think the difference between a prison stay and a jail stay is whether you've gotten a year or more, you're getting sent to the state and convicted of felony. And what I think we're the first state to appreciably change or at least constrain the ability of counties for a fairly large number of violations to send people to the state system. Whether it's the best way to do it, I don't know. I mean, but we've done it, something, and most states haven't. I think what's interesting about what we've done is we've blocked out whole portions of the penal code that are now, and then interacted with people's criminal history, and that's going to be a county issue. So even you can give people over a year or 2 years or 3 years, and that's not going to get them into state prison. What's going to get them into state prison is they commit and are convicted of a specific type of crime. I mean, I can think of other ways that maybe we would want to incentivize, keeping people locally. For example, the way in the 90s we changed what we charge counties for a juvenile commitment that led to very large decreases in commitments to CYA. But that's not what we did, right? We did a different path, probably because of the immediacy of the court order.
Hi, thank you both. Kathy Jett with California Forward. Again, another great report, guys. So I have 2 questions. One is, where do you go from here? What do you anticipate as your next report? And the second is just a comment on some work we're doing in the Central Valley counties that includes probation and jails and data is that we're finding extremely beneficial to help them learn how to look at the data. People that are coming in and out of their jails. In other words, looking at some of the same things that happen to the prison at the local level, and look at the practices, and looking at just simply by helping them see who they're reincarcerating, they're able to look at what are the evidence-based alternatives for people that aren't really committing new crimes. These are infractions, those types of things. So hopefully in the next year or so, we'll be able to share some of that data locally in what we're seeing, and get a more robust discussion going on about alternatives that are effective at the local level. But thank you again for a great report.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. On what we've got next, well, it's not unrelated to the issue that was brought up here. We are looking at prosecutorial changes, under realignment to see what are the experiences. We're going to be focusing on released offenders because those are the guys we can actually get the data on arrests and convictions. But to see what their experiences are when they're picked up on a parole violation, misdemeanor violation, or felony violation, break them down to get a sense of what happens. What are those changes to prosecutors' behaviors? What are they pursuing? So that's something that we hope to produce a report on by the fall of this year.
I think just to build on your point, there should be some additional research on the people that have outpatient mental health status that are coming out of CDCR, the EOP, and the triple CMS guys, because I think their experience is going to be very different pre and post realignment, and it should be it would be helpful to sketch that out and see how they're faring before and after.
Other questions? Well, I know I've sure had a tough job here, but please give a hand to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and we'll be here for questions afterwards as well.